The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
For 20 years, the United States was a stabilizing if not always welcome presence in Afghanistan. But the Taliban's return to power in August 2021, and the withdrawal of US troops, changed the political landscape of the country, and the region. To discuss these and related issues, join our live debate, bringing your questions, arguments and challenges. The event will broadcast live on all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum, on Thursday 22nd September 2022, 2 to 4 p.m. UK time.
Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world to a Democracy Forum debate on a topic that is veiled, shadowy, fascinating, and it might even seem to be off topic in the current climate. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 2 hours, and believe me that what we're about to discuss is pivotal. It might unfold into being as significant as the Soviet Union moving into Vietnam after America's defeat there in 1975, and by sheer geography, diminishing the US influence in this area that is now known as the Indo-Pacific. Is history repeating itself with another authoritarian superpower pitched against the US? Or is China being more subtle, less muscle flexing, less overtly threatening than the Soviet Union was? If Afghanistan is indeed the graveyard of empires, strategically pivotal, militarily and politically lethal, at least to Britain, the Soviet Union and the US, why would a canny, modern China even want to put a foot there? There are answers to these questions, and to explain China's Afghan agenda, we have a panel of experts who really know their stuff. Christine Fair, Mohammed Tayyab Safdar, Fatima Airan, Pamir Sahill, and Lucas Myers. Our debate will be summed up by video because Barry Gardiner, the chair of Democracy Forum, cannot be with us today. Parliamentary business is pressing, but his London constituency has been the home of many Afghan families impacted by last year's collapse, and China, of course, is closely under scrutiny now in the British Parliament. But first, as always, we are going to go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the canvas and the background on which we are to debate. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Since the precipitous withdrawal of United States and coalition troops from Kabul in August last year, and the collapse of the Afghan Republic, and the return of the Taliban-led administration, the Democracy Forum has regularly taken the opportunity to examine the consequences for regional geopolitics. Today, our attention is focused on China's foreign policy calculus and the role that it may pursue in the future development of Afghanistan. I thank everyone at the forum for arranging this event and for assembling a panel of eminent speakers. We're very grateful that they're all able to participate today. And on your behalf, I'd also like to thank Humphrey Hawksley for agreeing to chair the session. China has historically maintained a minimal relationship with Afghanistan, writes the Asia Affairs specialist Andrew Small. It wanted neither a Western victory that might entrench a US military presence in its backyard, nor a Taliban victory that could pose risks to Xinjiang. But since the departure of United States forces 12 months ago, China appears to be developing a five-pronged engagement policy towards Afghanistan, which includes a cautious but pragmatic acceptance of the Taliban's dominance, prevents the re-emergence of Afghanistan as a safe haven for terrorism, facilitates an inclusive political process, pursues humanitarian goals, while all the time pointedly and demonstrably shaming the United States and its allies for their abdication of responsibility, concludes Fang Zheng for the LSE Public Policy Review. In questioning the ultimate destination of this engagement strategy, some commentators wonder if this policy shift is, I quote, part of a new great game in the region for China's global economic and geostrategic aspiration, raising the prospect that China intends to use, I quote, Afghanistan as a stepping stone for broader regional, strategic, economic and political endeavor, moving towards realignment of the region's balance of power and hegemony. Certainly, China needs to ensure the security and stability of Xinjiang and its western border, but as others have concluded, I quote, in terms of both geopolitics and security, Beijing considers Afghanistan largely in a negative rather than a positive light. It's a problem to be managed and contained rather than an asset to be leveraged and exploited. It's unsurprising, perhaps, that much of China's foreign policy rhetoric, incited by Afghanistan over the past 12 months, has been prompted by its scorn and mockery of the chaotic nature of Western withdrawal. In a well-publicized telephone call to his opposite number in Iran just over a year ago, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi noted the United States' assertion that the withdrawal had a tactical reason to better concentrate on the twin challenges posed by Russia's threat to Eastern Europe and China's presence in the Pacific Rim. Indeed, some Chinese commentators have suggested that the essential purpose of the United States relinquishing the responsibilities accumulated in Afghanistan over 20 years was to spring a strategic trap, ensnaring China on its western periphery. So I'm looking forward to hearing the views of our panelists today, with news channels dominated in the last 24 hours by President Putin's call to mobilize military reservists. It's inevitable that China's next moves in Central Asia will be affected by the future realignment of regional hegemonies as the duration and consequential cost of Russia's war in Ukraine become clearer. How this may affect China's Afghanistan agenda remains to be seen. Writing jointly in the journal Foreign Policy in July, Raffaello Pantucci and Alexandros Peterson suggest, I quote, China is doomed to play a significant role in Afghanistan, but is desperate to avoid being trapped in Kabul's politics. They conclude, China has all the trappings and potential to be a dominant player, but has made a strategic decision to continue to watch from the sidelines. Well, welcome to the webinar, and if you have any questions or comments, please put them through the chair to the panel.
Bruce, a cautious, pragmatic China, preventing the safe haven, for terrorists, the West or the America's abdication of responsibility, and the Afghan trap, which you alluded to here. We're going to expand on that, beginning with our first speaker, Dr. Christine Fair, Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fair has served in a myriad of roles directly related to our topic, United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, combating terrorism, the West Point, Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, and she's going to examine for us Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban, remembering, of course, that close alliance between Pakistan and China. Dr. Christine Fair, please give us your thoughts.
All right. So thank you very much. Because of the time difference, I can't stay for the duration of the panel because I have to go and teach. So I hope you'll understand when I have to.
We'll bear with you.
Beg off shortly. So what I'd actually planned to talk about was the history, the sort of prehistory of China's engagement with the Taliban. As I sort of watched the coverage of this and the press coverage of this, there seems to be some impression that this is somewhat new post 2001. And I thought it would actually be helpful to provide a historical background to this relationship. What may or may not be appreciated is that Beijing actually began formulating its ties with Afghan Islamists during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. And by the time that the Soviets had actually departed Afghanistan in February of '89, Chinese support for the Mujahideen effort was in excess of $100 million. And what also may not be terribly well appreciated is that China actually supported Chinese Uyghur Muslims' participation in that anti-Soviet jihad. And it was the success of the Mujahideen and the defeat of the Soviets that it energized what would become the Uyghur separatists' own aspirations. And consequently, it would be a desire to get control of these potential Uyghur separatists and the transnational networks in which they were embedded in Afghanistan that motivated Beijing to reach out to the Taliban in the 1990s. So this is a relationship that has a longer history than post-2001. So throughout the 1990s, just as we're seeing echoes today, the Taliban were not then capable of governing. They were certainly less so than they are today. And so the Chinese assistance that was on the table was much desired. And so actually throughout the 1990s, the Chinese were giving all sorts of economic assistance as well as humanitarian assistance. And the only request that they asked was that the Uyghurs, as well as other Islamist groups, not use Afghanistan as a basis from which they would attack China. So in 1998, the Chinese had agreed to open up formal trade ties with the newly formed Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and to increase the volume of Chinese food aid. And this was followed by a deal in 2000 for Chinese firms to build telecommunications infrastructure in Kandahar and Kabul and to repair Afghanistan's power grid, which had obviously been damaged by years of war. And on the eve of 9/11, the Chinese had established itself as the largest foreign investor in Afghanistan, with several tens of millions of dollars in investments in telecommunications and construction. Militarily, the Chinese consistently aided the Taliban in their struggle against the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance throughout the Afghan Civil War, providing arms, spare parts, and maintenance services for the Taliban's forces. And of course, it should be remembered that the Northern Alliance was supported militarily by India, Tajikistan, Iran, Russia, and episodically the United States. The Indians had consistently in place a brigadier level defense advisor to the Northern Alliance. And it might also not be remembered that on the eve of 9/11 itself, the Chinese were very close to inking an agreement with Al-Qaeda. And then obviously that agreement became very quickly overtaken by the events of 9/11. But in this period, even in this period, Taliban officials accede that the Taliban were aided financially in considerable measure by the Chinese, but the Chinese never recognized their regime, in large part reflecting the international distaste with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. So after the Taliban were defeated in 2001, China had to shift gears because China realized that it had really overinvested in this Taliban relationship, and it really didn't have relations with other power centers in Afghanistan. So from about 2001 to 2013, you really see China trying to re-optimize its baskets of relations with the country. It also moved to become the most significant foreign investor in Afghanistan. But I think is well known, most of their investments in minerals and so forth have not really fructified because even the security umbrella of NATO wasn't adequate to allow China to get those resources out of the ground and into market. But throughout this period, what China was able to do was to forge decent relationships with the problematically, but nonetheless democratically elected governments that were in Afghanistan. But throughout that period, it also continued to lobby for the Taliban. They were consistently arguing that any sort of negotiated settlement, and they were arguing this along with their Pakistani allies, should include the Taliban, that to exclude the Taliban would not provide an enduring peace. And so this is this position that they were largely eking out. Things began to change in 2013 under Xi. So in October 2013, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party convened to discuss China's neighborhood policy. And while they wouldn't describe this policy going forward as a complete revision, they would simply describe it as tweaking a policy that was already working to serve Chinese interests. And it was here that the two landmark initiatives of China's grand strategic goals in this neighborhood were announced: the Silk Road Economic Belt, as well as the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. And both of these together have been subsequently dubbed as the Belt and Road Initiative. And Afghanistan's central geopolitical position and its abundant natural resources led to its addition to the BRI in 2016. But nothing has really changed on the ground. The instability in Afghanistan continues to threaten the economic viability of BRI. I would also argue that the stability or instability in Afghanistan also threatens to undermine some of the most significant economic value that could come out of the CPEC, which is the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, although more accurately, in my view, called basically a corridor to exploit Pakistan for Chinese enrichment. Ultimately, throughout this period, the security umbrella that was provided by NATO really hasn't afforded the Taliban, or excuse me, the Chinese to get those resources out of the ground. The Chinese under Xi continued to press for reconciliation in a way that included the Taliban. And it's really in this period that we see these ties between the Chinese and the Taliban become regular features. Since the takeover of the Taliban over a year or so ago, the Taliban themselves seem to be banking upon China's ability to get the various resources out of the ground and into market to fund the Taliban's government, given the well-known economic crises that continue to face this government. And you see that the Taliban have been offering various security guarantees. But the problem is that the Taliban are not the sole providers of violence in Afghanistan. And in fact, what we've seen after the Taliban takeover is that the Islamic State has become a really important rival to the Taliban in the production of this violence. So moving forward, I anticipate that the drivers of the fundaments of what brought the Chinese to the table with the Taliban in the first instance are going to remain in place. I don't certainly don't see any reason for the Chinese to retrench. But I remain unconvinced that the Taliban are going to be able to provide these Chinese firms with the assistance that they require to make these investments truly worthwhile. And then there are a couple of things that the Taliban themselves have done that strain potentially the Taliban's relationships with others. So many of you will probably recall the last several months, the Taliban actually reached out to the Indians. They asked the Indians to restore their mission. They asked the Indians to restore aid. And this was, simply driven by the Taliban's inability to govern and the dire food shortage that has swept across Afghanistan. You recall one of the reasons why the Pakistanis were so interested in the Taliban from the beginning. Prior to 2001, you could argue that the Taliban hadn't delivered on many of the things that Pakistan had wanted. They were never going to cede, for example, to the Durand Line. But what the Taliban did do is that they were able to restrain Indian influence in the country, largely to the Panjshir and India's support for the Northern Alliance. What the Taliban have done is that they've essentially asked the Indians to come back, open up your consulates, open up your embassy, and keep doing business. This is not something that the Pakistanis are going to be terribly thrilled about. I'm also not sure that this kind of overture is, I would imagine, and I'm certainly interested in hearing the views of the other panelists, that the Chinese themselves are pretty ambivalent about this, because within the theory, within Afghanistan itself, the Chinese are certainly interested in stability for the simple reasons of profit extraction. But at a geopolitical level, it was in part, this incessant rivalry between India and Pakistan that makes Pakistan so useful, because the more Pakistan is a pain to India, it takes a little bit off of the pressure from China. So I don't think that the Chinese are going to fare any better than the United States and its NATO partners did in that period between 2001 to 2022. I think the only difference is that the Chinese are much more risk acceptant. If you look at Chinese development projects, wherever they go, they're much more willing to put their workers at risk. I can't think of any other country that is as risk acceptant to the danger and even death of their employees. We see the constant danger that Chinese are subjected to in Pakistan, and it doesn't seem to deter the Chinese. So that's one advantage that the Chinese have relative to US and NATO. But I'm still really skeptical that the Chinese are going to be able to do many of the things that the Taliban are hopeful of the Chinese actually being able to do. Thank you.
Very much for that. I just wanted to clarify one thing. I think you made it clear between encapsulated. So in the 1990s, the Chinese were helping and investing in the Taliban there on the condition that nothing of their doctrine or whatever spread into Xinjiang and encouraged or gave base to the Uyghur separatists. That's right, is it?
Yeah, and actually the Taliban, from a Chinese point of view, pretty much honored that commitment.
They did manage to honor that. And then
can I just make one point about this doesn't get remarked upon enough. By the time we're in the 1990s, we already have ample evidence of Chinese oppression, not only of Uyghur Muslims, but other Muslims in China. Of all of the various speeches that Osama bin Laden gave, he never once excoriated China.
And you mentioned that they were on the eve of striking a deal with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden on the eve of 9/11. What exactly was that deal going to give Al-Qaeda and give China?
So, I mean, essentially, Al-Qaeda at that point were closely associated with the Taliban. But what China wanted was Al-Qaeda's assurance that there would not be attacks in China. And in exchange for that, the Chinese would continue its commitment to Afghanistan. But this was literally, if you look at the press coverage, there was a little bit of it that came out. These negotiations were literally taking place 2 weeks before 9/11.
this was Chinese diplomats talking to bin Laden himself or Al-Qaeda officials, or if they have officials?
So, I'm going to defer to other panelists on this issue. I don't know the details because I only saw the press reportage, and the press reportage was pretty skimpy on the details. But it is fairly well recognized that the Chinese were negotiating with Al-Qaeda on the eve of 9/11.
Okay, and just to put it in a larger perspective, in a way, China is being very pragmatic here, whereas the West was not pragmatic. We didn't deal with the Taliban at all. Hence, they were harboring terrorists that carried out 9/11 and might be harboring again.
Yeah, I mean, so we can very easily, with greater hindsight and wisdom, rethink that Taliban policy. We can rethink even how we responded to 9/11, and I think that's fruitful. But the fact of the matter is, there were 30 odd years of isolating the Taliban. And from my point of view, I was certainly a young analyst, but even by 9/11, I had spent at that point about 20 years studying Pakistan and South Asia. From my point of view, the Taliban were, and they to a considerable extent are, they were parochial actors, right? They weren't interested in targeting the United States. But then, to play devil's advocate a little bit, when the United States did adopt that approach, and I might add Saudi Arabia did the same thing, in approaching the Taliban to give up Osama bin Laden, they weren't willing to do so. And many people, including myself, believe that the Al-Qaeda assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud, which was the first suicide attack ever in Afghanistan, was done to solidify the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, to make it impossible for the Taliban to defect. And this has been a relationship that has perdured, right? Despite whatever was said at Doha, the Taliban have not given up their relations with Al-Qaeda.
And I know you have to go, so I'm going to put to you one question that's come in from the audience.
I can stay for the next half hour, and then I got to go teach online.
No, we're moving on to other panelists.
I want to hear the other panelists. That's what I'm saying. I'm going to stay as long as I can, up to the point where I have to go to class.
Oh, okay. But if you could just answer this one, Naveed, how might potential tensions in China's relationship with the Taliban place new pressures on the China-Pakistan partnership? Big question, short answer, please.
Well, I mean, I don't really see these tensions that he's asking about. I mean, that's what makes the China relationship with the Taliban, it's so good. Now, what I will say, I actually think the tensions go the other way. Pakistan hasn't been accustomed to having another major player dictate what the Taliban do and how they do it. The fact that they opened up this channel to India, I think, gives you a pretty good insight into how the Taliban are trying to distance themselves. As you know, there are a lot of factions within the Taliban, and considerable representatives of these factions resent Pakistan. They understand that Pakistan is only interested in controlling Afghanistan, using the Taliban as an instrument to do so. So I actually think that the relationship between China and the Taliban will put stressors on the Pakistan-Taliban and the Pakistan-China relations, not the other way around.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Christine Fair, for that. Please stay as long as you can in case other questions than that come in. Now we're going to Mohammed Tayyab Safdar of the East Asia Center at the University of Virginia, who is a specialist in development in the Global South, particularly after the launch of China's Belt and Road Initiative about a decade ago. Dr. Safdar is going to describe to us that delicate balancing act that Beijing has to follow, particularly given the role of Pakistan in the region. Mohammed Tayyab Safdar, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. Thank you very much to the Democracy Forum as well for inviting me to today's panel. So as has already been pointed out by Professor Fair, the relationship between the Taliban and the Chinese is quite old, so it's not something that's just happened. But of course, the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan has profound implications, not only for China, but also, of course, for the broader region in which, of South Asia and Central Asia as well. So from the Chinese perspective, there are two fundamental objectives that are important as far as Afghanistan is concerned. One is, of course, already been pointed out by Lord Bruce, which is domestic stability. Xinjiang, maintaining control over Xinjiang and ensuring that Afghanistan does not act as a staging ground for Uyghur militants is one of the most important, or is the primary objective as far as Beijing's relationship with Afghanistan is concerned. And of course, Xinjiang has gained increasing strategic importance after the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in the 13th five-year plan, which was launched in 2016. Chinese policymakers refer to Xinjiang as the core region for the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is, of course, the overland component of the Belt and Road Initiative. The second objective, which is aligned with the first one of maintaining domestic stability and ensuring that regional tensions do not spill over, is trying to protect the substantial Chinese investments that have already taken place in neighboring countries, especially the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Over the last 7 odd years, Chinese firms have invested tens of billions of dollars in Pakistan's power sector. So that's the foreign direct investment that's come in from the Chinese into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and making sure or protecting these investments is extremely important from the Chinese perspective. And of course, over the last year or so, we've seen how Chinese interests have been targeted within Pakistan as well. As the economic footprint has increased in Pakistan, Chinese interests have come under increasing attacks from the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. We had the attack in Quetta on the Chinese ambassador at the Serena Hotel in 2021. This was followed by perhaps the worst sort of attack on the Chinese in Pakistan in a long time, which was in Dasu at the site of a dam that a large Chinese state-owned enterprise was constructing in that area, where 9 Chinese engineers were killed in that attack. And while Professor Fairs rightly said that the Chinese are not averse to taking risks, this attack had a reaction from Beijing. The Chinese firm withdrew all of its employees from the site. The Chinese also postponed the Joint Coordination Committee meeting of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And of course, this was the first time that the meeting was being held in 2 years. So that's quite a substantial, or that's quite a message that the Chinese sent at that particular point as well. So the attack by the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan is quite significant in terms of the impact of the TTP on China-Pakistan relations. And of course, the TTP considers the Chinese to be fair game because of the support to the Pakistani state. And of course, more worryingly, there were reports that the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, had coordinated with the TTP in terms of planning the attack on the engineers in Dasu. Now that takes us to the difficult sort of balancing act that the Chinese have in the region. So I'll talk first of all the Chinese reaction to this sort of a balancing act, and then I'll come to the sort of challenges that the Chinese face in terms of trying to mediate or balance the relationship between Pakistan, China, and Pakistan on the one hand, and China and Afghanistan on the other hand. So as has been the case over the last, sort of 7 to 10 years, especially since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, the narrative very much is of win-win economic cooperation. And the idea is that through increase or better economic integration, one can deal with the kind of, or improve stability within the region, focusing particularly on Afghanistan. So Chinese policymakers believe that the region's future sustainability lies in fostering regional economic integration. In this vision, economic growth and the development narrative can play a pivotal role in stabilizing Afghanistan and bringing economic dividends to the Taliban regime. And of course, part of it is driven by economic, sort of returns, but a large part of what China's doing is driven by strategic strategic reasons as well, as has rightly been pointed out by Raffaello Banducci and his collaborators in different parts of the world. So how do you attain this sort of regional stability? In Chinese academic discourse and in the think tank world within China as well, there is this focus, or there is this idea of a CPEC plus. And the idea is that Afghanistan is central to this sort of a vision of CPEC plus. And the idea basically is that Pakistan connects with Central Asian countries which are landlocked, and Central Asian countries can use Afghanistan as a route to Pakistan, to the Pakistani ports, focusing particularly on Gwadar, and the increased imports and exports, or the flow of goods through Afghanistan, can contribute to improved economic performance in Afghanistan through the transit revenues that they can generate. From Pakistan's perspective, operationalizing, if this traffic, emerges, that provides a chance to operationalize Gwadar. So Gwadar at the moment has been, it's been there for a long time, almost 2 decades, and there isn't a lot of traffic that's been generated in Gwadar as well. So from Islamabad's perspective, this gives them the chance to generate some sort of traffic from Gwadar, because at the end of the day, interviews in Islamabad also show that the radiation zone for this port in Gwadar is Central Asia and other countries in the region. The second variant of the CPEC plus sort of a model, if one was to call it that, is bringing Iran on board as well. So China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, sort of an economic corridor, which sort of, once again, the idea is that, you bring all of these countries on board, and by bringing all of these countries on board, you can alleviate some of the strategic tensions, or the sort of geostrategic problems that are faced in Western China, and you can extend it all the way to Turkey as well. However, despite all of the wonderful, sort of things that we've talked about, and China's hopes that we can have a CPEC plus sort of strategy going forward, there are substantial sort of tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan, or there are emerging tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which the Chinese will have to contend with, and which the Chinese could potentially fall in between. The relationship between as has already once again been pointed out by Professor Fair, the relationship between the Afghanistan Taliban and Pakistan has remained tense, to say the least. In this month alone, in September alone, the attacks that have been claimed, or that have been attributed to the TTP, or firing from Afghanistan, has claimed the lives of 9 Pakistani soldiers. Also, there are reports of resurgent Taliban activity, Tehrik-e-Taliban activity within the settled regions of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, including in Swat as well as in Dir. Just to remind our viewers, Swat, of course, had to face the brunt of this Taliban sort of rule, Tehrik-e-Taliban rule, from 2007 to 2009, after which there was an attack, the military, sort of flushed these militants out, but there have been renewed attacks on politicians, on members of peace committees within the Swat region as well. So even though the sort of ceasefire that was agreed on between Pakistan and the TTP is still holding, however, the increased sort of attacks on Pakistani security forces and on civil society members and on politicians in the region, that raises pressure on the Pakistani establishment to take some actions. And of course, the Pakistani establishment has been very clear that one of the sort of reasons that they supported the Taliban is that these sort of they were very harsh on the previous regime, that they were not taking actions to sort of counter the TTP and Baloch separatist groups within Afghanistan as well. So we see that the ability of the Taliban to actually control the TTP is largely limited. And whether this is by design or they're giving a free rein, that is open to interpretation as well. And of course, before this as well, there were other sort of stresses in the relationship as well. From the Afghan perspective, of course, as once again has been rightly pointed out by Professor Fair, very tough, to follow her. The relationship is there are various stressors as far as the Afghans are concerned as well. One of the prime reasons that has come in the news recently is the treatment of Afghans who are crossing over the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan. There have been reports. I just read a tweet by a journalist who had who crossed over from Afghanistan to Pakistan from the border crossing, and even for Pakistanis, the kind of sort of tension that they had to go through in order to cross the border crossing was quite substantial. So the way that the treatment of Afghans, both traders as well as ordinary citizens, the way they're treated at the border is a major sort of question mark on the relationship between the Afghans and Pakistan, and that's been highlighted at multiple times by the Taliban. For their part, Pakistanis haven't really reacted in the way that they should, because this is a low-hanging fruit basically. That they can, improve the flow of goods and people over the Torkham border. The second point, which again is important and historically extremely, extremely important for us to remember, is the Durand Line, which of course the British British negotiated with the Afghans in 1893. There's a almost 2,500 odd long, border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in 1893, the British drew this line called the Durand Line, which has survived for the last 120 odd years. But subsequent governments in Kabul have raised questions about the legality of the Durand Line, after Pakistan came into inception, Pakistan gained independence, and the Taliban are no exception. They have also raised concerns about the legality of the Durand Line, one, and there have been, repeated skirmishes between the Pakistani military and Taliban fighters along the border as Pakistan continues to fence the border. So from the Afghan side, these sort of tensions and these challenges, of course, remain. And as has been rightly pointed out, the Taliban have started looking at elsewhere for other patterns within the region as well, who are more powerful economically, who have more clout as compared to the Pakistanis. So just to sum everything up that I've discussed, while China continues to take a more active role in the region, and the narrative very much is one of win-win economic connectivity, and improving regional integration, regional infrastructure in order to improve integration within the region. The sort of underlying tensions on the ground remain, largely intractable in many ways. From the Pakistani perspective, the continued attacks on the Pakistani military, on politicians and on civil society members in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa continues to put pressure on the establishment to act and to take a tougher line. From the Afghan perspective, on the other hand, the sort of relationship with Pakistan, as has been pointed out once again, there are multiple groups within the Taliban as well. So the relationship is not without tensions, because of the underlying historical and the political, dimensions of this sort of a conflict. So while on the drawing board, at least, regional integration, improving infrastructure, improving connectivity between Central Asia, using Afghanistan as a conduit to Pakistan makes sense, right? From economic perspective as well, for Pakistan, it makes sense. Because if there is traffic that is generated, there can be an increased, flow of resources to Pakistan as well, in the form of, custom tariff or, other sort of economic benefits as well. However, implementing these, connectivity mires on the ground is extremely difficult, not only because of the security situation in Afghanistan, which is not very positive, but also because of the ongoing sort of a almost, I wouldn't call it a conflict, but the ongoing tensions between the regime in Afghanistan and the Pakistani establishment. So for Beijing, sort of keeping old alliances in place while building new ones remains questionable. I do not think that China would want to invest directly in Afghanistan because of the security situation once again, and the costs of doing so are so substantially high. So as things sort of evolve, or as things stand at the moment, the balancing act will continue to tax policymakers in Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is one labyrinth of a balancing act you've put out there. I have a question that's going to come in, but I just want to, from an audience member, but you talked about this balance between the Chinese investment or the economic opportunities there and the strategic level. Christine Farron, yourself talked about Chinese officials and people getting killed, diplomats getting actually killed there. In Beijing, would they have drawn a red line on that? Because this is where a big power gets sucked into war, or that, as the Americans have found out many times. What is the thinking in Beijing of that, as much as you know it, compared to, say, the thinking in a comparable American situation from history?
So the risk appetite is greater in Beijing. So that's clear. So the risk appetite is greater, as investments in Pakistan have shown, as the attacks in Pakistan have shown. Beijing is willing to provide more of a leeway as far as its citizens are concerned. However, as I pointed out in my talk, at this particular time in 2021, when the attack in Dasu took place, the fact that the JCC was cancelled, the fact that the Chinese companies said, no, we're not going to work till you provide us some security guarantees or improve the security situation, that provides us evidence that China started seeing itself as an emerging great power. So going forward, there is going to be a more, I wouldn't say muscular, along the same lines as the United States level of muscular with bombs and boots on the ground and those sort of things happening, but it is going to make sure that partners such as Pakistan, for example, know that they're not pleased with the way that things are going.
Okay, that's so can I give you Rashid Ali's question, which I think is apt for our conversation at the moment? Is the Belt and Road likely to ever materialize in Afghanistan?
Well, it's the fact that they're talking about it, and the fact that the Chinese solution to these problems, which have very deep historical and social, reasons, that they're trying to deal with these through economic measures alone, means that it's probably not going to, work in the way that they expect it to work. But I mean, in all honesty, if these roads do get built in Afghanistan to transport these goods, etc., I do think in the short run, it's quite difficult, but in the medium run, one never really knows. And of course, the point that I've not highlighted is the ongoing geopolitical sort of tension between a risen power or the global power, which is the United States, and the Chinese as an emerging, global power.
Isn't there a vast copper mine just near Kabul that the Chinese have got a 30-year contract on or something? Is that up and running, or is that gone now completely?
I haven't heard of that being running. I do know that there is a substantial Chinese presence now in Kabul as well, but I don't think, once again, it's about the risk appetite. It's about whether they're willing, the risk return sort of matrix that they're looking at. Because they've seen how the United States and its allies fared in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. So once again, they would not want to, make the same mistakes as the United States did. Having foreign direct investment and having Chinese nationals on the ground in terms of these sticky sort of investments basically means that you're opening yourself to attacks, right? Whether you're willing to, sort of to absorb those risks going forward without getting sucked into this quagmire is a major sort of a question for Beijing. And I don't think that, given the sort of broader geopolitical sort of matrix that we're looking at, that Beijing at this moment in time has the appetite to open another front on the ground.
And of course, unlike the US, Beijing, at least on the surface or publicly, isn't ideological. So they're not trying to export democracy or anything like that.
Exactly. And last but not the least, unlike the United States as well, China is in the neighborhood, right? So the geography matters a lot for whatever happens. The geographical aspect needs to be kept in mind, even though China is an emerging power, global power. Its geography remains, similar. It has multiple different sort of challenges in the West, including Xinjiang, including its relationship with the Central Asian states, with Pakistan, with India. And on the other hand, towards the South China Sea, you see this emerging sort of almost a geopolitical Cold War between the United States and China. So on both ends, they are sort of changing, dealing with a rapidly evolving sort of a challenge. So balancing those two challenges, making sure that they both do not end up, having a negative impact on China's economic growth, is somewhat of a challenge for policymakers.
That's true. Thank you so much, Mohammed Tayyab Safdar. Please hang around. We will have other questions coming in, and we are now going to Fatima Airan, who was once a senior official in the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan and is now, and that ended last year, I believe, when everything else ended, and is now with the Weidenfeld Hoffman Trust at the University of Oxford, consulting and researching on global development. She will be explaining Afghanistan's aid, technical cooperation, and investment relationship with China, and tell us or focus on exactly where Beijing's interests lie. Fatima Airan, please tell us what you know.
Thank you very much. So since I was working with them at the Ministry on Afghanistan-China relationship, I would give brief information about the relationship and cooperation between the two countries between 2001 and 2021. In 2001, China committed to take an active part in the construction of Afghanistan like other Western countries. And the Good Neighborly Agreement, which was originally signed in 1965, was re-signed in 2002. However, China's relations with Afghanistan regarding economics remained insignificant in 20 years. China did not take part in a pooled funding mechanism to channel aid to Afghanistan like other Western countries. However, regular MOUs under the title Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreements were signed regularly to allow the aid to flow from China to Afghanistan. Between 2001 and 2021, the total amount of aid that flew to Afghanistan from China amounted around $700 million, according to the documents we have available at the Ministry of Finance, and according to the data from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. Regarding investment, China, in 2007, Afghanistan internationally auctioned Airan copper mine, which is the largest estimated copper deposit in Afghanistan. And two Chinese investment companies won the contract, and a 30-year lease worth $3.4 billion to extract 11 million tons of copper. However, the project was the extraction was supposed to start, but due to political, social, and also technical problems, it never materialized until the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum had to close the contract in 2017. Also in 2011, a consortium of a Chinese company and two Afghan companies won the contract to extract the oil and gas resources in northern Afghanistan in Amu Darya Basin. But a year later, nothing was extracted, and to this day, the Chinese company closed. The Afghan Minister of Mine and Petroleum before 2021 had to close the contract. Regarding Afghanistan's involvement in Belt and Road Initiative, the agreement was signed in 2016. They couldn't do it earlier in 2013 and 14 because of the election in Afghanistan. To materialize this, in 2014 actually, 5 nation railway corridor was signed. An agreement was signed, and including countries China, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Tajikistan. And they committed to help Afghanistan build railway from Kunduz province to Herat, and around more than 1,000 kilometers would pass through Afghanistan. But by 2020, only 50% of technical and economic survey was done, and now currently it's stalled. And also they initiated Digital Silk Road, which is currently stalled, and we didn't see any progress on that. Regarding China's Taliban and their future plan, as Professor Fair pointed, after 2001, actually, in 2013, Taliban political office in Doha was invited to China, and they had, according to journalist Fair, they were in Beijing. And they had subsequent meetings in 2014. China's special envoy to Afghanistan met with Taliban's officials, and there was another meeting in 2015 held in China between Taliban representatives and Afghan representatives to speak about peace process. And there was another one in 2016, which was a high level. And in 2019, when Taliban carried an attack in September 2019 in Kabul, the talks in Doha stopped for some times, and China wanted to invite Taliban officials from Doha to speak peace and counterterrorism. However, it didn't happen because of COVID-19. China was one of the few countries that did not shut its embassy in Kabul after Taliban's takeover on August 15, 2021. And China called Taliban a crucial military and political force. And China and Taliban's spokesperson said in a conference that they helped China play a great role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, and they called them their most important partner. However, China, since Taliban's takeover, provided 31 million to Taliban to help them. And as we know that China do not take part in the way foreign Western countries provide aid to in the construction processes, Taliban can either take loans with higher interest, or they can provide the opportunity for Chinese companies to come and invest in Afghanistan, which didn't happen because of hasn't happened yet because of the situation inside the country now in terms of security. Also, regarding the progress between the Taliban and China in the past 1 year, they signed a contract to build a Chinatown in Kabul, which is, according to data, 10-story shopping center. Also, they on September 10th, 2022, they had a meeting in Uzbekistan where they signed an agreement including countries China, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan that would allow the goods to come from China to Afghanistan and the other way around. Also, China has been very active in the UN. They disregard the human rights violation and all the women rights violation committed, and they call them an internal affair that they do not want to take part or interfere. And they have asked to allow 13 Taliban officials to be allowed to travel to other countries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I wonder if I could just ask a very fundamental question. If China was not aiding the Taliban, as we've heard all these years, if it just walked off from that, would the Taliban be able to survive as a unified force? Is it 100% reliant on Chinese help and aid?
So in August 2021, when Taliban took over, they were hoping and they were very much looking forward to get help from China. But I think by now they know that they would not be able to receive any kind of aid from China to be able to run the economy, because China does not take part in Western type of aid to developing countries or countries in a situation like Afghanistan.
Yes, and were you with the finance ministry until August last year, or did you leave before that?
I was until August 15, 2021.
And then you fled, did you?
Yes, yes.
Goodness, that must have been and we have a question from Rimjin Sud here, which I'll put up on the screen. I'll read it as it is. Can China facilitate a more inclusive politics in Afghanistan, given the single faction nature of the Taliban?
Probably they could, if they keep their influence on the Taliban, on the Taliban, because back in 2000, I think it was 2015, they hold a meeting between the representative of the Afghan government and the Taliban to talk about peace process in China. Mm-hmm. But I think China would not be able to encourage the Taliban. They can try, but I think it's very difficult now, considering the situation inside Afghanistan.
So you have a disunified Taliban, as we've been hearing. You've got attacks coming in, as we've been hearing, on Chinese in the area, on Chinese officials and diplomats. Taliban on Pakistanis. So you've got this sort of simmering violence coming up there. You worked in the finance ministry amid the hope that none of this was going to happen. What do you think about it all now? Give us a bit of personal feeling.
So none of the women I was working with at the Minister of Finance is now working there. And a few months ago, in the beginning, they were asked to wait. But after a few months, they were asked to send a male family members to work instead of them, because they cannot work at the Ministry of Finance, which has been very difficult. And most of the people I know who were working at the Ministry of Finance, who had good education background and studied in good universities, are not in Afghanistan now and are not contributing to the economy. Even back then, actually, when maybe late 2021 or general in 2021, China was not interested in working with the Minister of Finance. We kept sending the embassy emails, but they were not really responsive. They were more interested in politics than they were in the economy.
Interesting. So could you just sum up for us the title of the book, or your views on that, China's Afghan Agenda? I premised you by saying, what exactly Beijing's interest lies. What is China's Afghan agenda? In a couple of words.
I think now China's Afghan agenda is just like wait and see, because it depends on the political insecurity situation inside Afghanistan. If it improves, China has the ability, because Taliban has invited them, they can go and extract the resources and invest in the country. But if the political situation or in the security worsen, I believe they would not take the risk of investing in a country that is not stable currently.
So this is unlike the Soviet Union and unlike the United States. China is seeing Afghanistan as something that can be avoided.
Yes,
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for that, and please stay with us because I'm sure we'll have more questions coming in. We are now going to Pamir Sahill from the School of International Relations and Diplomacy, the Jan Masaryk Center for International Studies for Economic Business at Prague University, and he's also with the Anglo-American University in Prague as well. His doctoral research focuses on the discourses of the US war on terror, state building in Afghanistan, and his current focus is on post-conflict state building and associated issues with that. He's going to be talking about what security guarantees the Taliban has made to China and how it views the role of Pakistan. Pamir Sahill, tell us what you know, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Most of the people who were here before me, Dr. Safdar, Airan, and also Professor Fair, have explained a lot, and they have touched upon different areas. I just want to begin with two things. One, about what the China's agenda of Afghanistan on Afghanistan might be. So last year, after the Taliban takeover, a couple of months later, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met the Taliban Deputy Prime Minister and the acting Foreign Minister of the Taliban government in Doha, in Qatar. And there he had to elaborate on his expectations for the future of Afghanistan. The first thing what he asked the Taliban was that they must build a more open and inclusive political structure in which all ethnic groups and factions will be integrated and included. Second, he asked for implementation of moderate and prudent domestic and foreign policies. And then, and he stressed upon the rights of women and children. Third, he asked the Taliban to break ties with all terrorist forces, including the Islamic State in the ETIM, or East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which has changed its name now. It is known as the Turkestan Islamic Party, and take measures to combat them. And finally, Wang Yi asked the Taliban leaders to pursue a peaceful foreign policy and live in harmony with other countries. These were the 4 points that he asked for, and I quoted them. So all of the 4 points from the Chinese Foreign Ministry's website. So when it comes to these 4 things that China has asked, it looks like China is in line with the rest of the West on these issues: to form an inclusive government, to protect the rights of women and children, to fight against terrorist groups, international and transnational terrorist groups, including the Uyghur militants who have in the past 2 decades launched multiple attacks in the Western Xinjiang province in China, and also in other parts of China. They have plotted attacks, and in some cases, the suspected militants were arrested as well. What happened this year, in mid-May, Turkestan Islamic Party released a video of its leader, Abdul Haq Turkestani, who was shown in northern Afghanistan. And he was celebrating Eid holiday with it's a Muslim holiday with other militants and his own people. And then he was seen roaming around in one of the northern provinces of Afghanistan. Presumably it was Kunduz province, where he was meeting the Taliban leaders and also other people. Last year in November, the Taliban government spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid told Voice of America that the Chinese government have asked us for security guarantees. And when the journalist asked him, so what was the response of the Taliban government? He said, we said yes to that. And the Chinese have promised that we will in return invest in Afghanistan and we will take part in Afghanistan's economic affairs. That promise that he made last year in November was contradicted by the presence of the Turkestan Islamic Party's leader in Afghanistan, openly releasing a video and meeting people in Afghanistan. But this year, after the earthquake in southeastern Afghanistan in July, the Chinese ambassador in Afghanistan, Wang Yu, he told journalists that beside emergency humanitarian aid, it's his quote, after the political changes last year and after the earthquake, we also have long-term economic reconstruction plans in Afghanistan. And then he said that the priority would be trade, followed by investment, as well as agriculture. So something that inconsistent happened, the emergence of Turkestan movement's leader in Afghanistan, and then afterwards, a couple of months later, the ambassador saying that we have plans of future reconstruction in Afghanistan. These are two contradictory things, but I believe that so far I have spoken to the Taliban. I know that they have given them firm guarantees that the presence of the Islamic, the Turkestan Islamic Party in Afghanistan or its leaders in Afghanistan will not pose any threat to China. And when we look at this from that perspective, that okay, he can be in Afghanistan as far as he wants to stay, because we will not break away ties with them, with the Uyghur militants, because they are close to us. Same is the case with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, that they have been allowed to reside in Afghanistan. I believe that China is still interested in Afghanistan to a degree that it wants to take part in the economic reconstruction as well. And the first step has been taken already. Yesterday, the September 21st, the first cargo from Chinese province of Xinjiang was expected to arrive in Afghanistan, in northern Afghanistan's Hairatan border crossing, which is bordering with Uzbekistan. This first cargo includes food and other like daily use items that China has sent to Afghanistan, not a part of aid, but as part of the bilateral trade. And this cargo moved 500 kilometers from Xinjiang province through Kyrgyzstan and then entered Uzbekistan and arrived, I believe it arrived yesterday, because yesterday was the day of its arrival, in Afghanistan in 9 days. So it took almost 3 months less, because the Chinese trade, which currently is going on with Afghanistan, it takes 3 months through Pakistan. China sends its stuff through the seaport to Karachi, and then from Karachi by road the cargo arrives in Afghanistan. So it appears that China has taken first steps of doing trade with Afghanistan, or enhancing bilateral trade with Afghanistan, in return of the security guarantees, as well as Chinese interest in Afghanistan's mineral sector. The Masaryk copper mine never materialized, as Dr. Safdar and Airan said, but China is more interested not in copper anymore in Afghanistan, because the copper prices have fallen a lot during the past 9 months or so. And China is not interested in that. The other reason behind that issue with Masaryk is that the former Afghan government had created some hurdles for China, and they were justified hurdles, impediments that they had created, because Afghanistan wanted a more sustainable way of extraction. Along with Afghanistan had forced a Chinese company to build a hospital. In return, China built a clinic kind of structure there in Logar province, which is near Kabul, just to say that, yes, we are building a hospital for the workers who will be working here. And another reason for the delay in that materialization of that project was that Buddha times archaeological sites were discovered, and the international community had urged Afghanistan not to damage those important sites, including the United Nations. You know, some of the teams had arrived and they had asked the Afghan government not to damage those sites that are very close to the copper mine. But now China seems to be interested more in lithium, because China is producing computers and mobile phones, and lithium batteries are needed in that. Second is that China is interested in cobalt and in nickel as well, because Afghanistan has a lot of reservoirs of both all of these metals, including the rare earth elements. So the first step has been taken in the form of the bilateral trade, and I believe that China will not contribute much to Afghanistan's reconstruction, because it has found an alternative route through which it can import raw materials, including lithium, from Afghanistan through the Central Asian states, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And in terms of investment, China might be interested in investing in these type of elements in Afghanistan. But when we look at the internal situation, domestic situation in Afghanistan, we have found out that the Islamic State is really posing a big threat and challenge to Afghanistan's Taliban government. Not in the terms of just attacks, but the way, you know, the Islamic State is building a narrative in Afghanistan. Every week or every 10 days, we see that the Islamic State is publishing its propaganda magazines in Pashto language, in Dari language, both of our national languages of Afghanistan and official languages of Afghanistan, as well as in Urdu, in Arabic, and in Turkish as well. So these magazines are widely distributed online, as well as in printed form in Afghanistan. Also, the Islamic State is rather quick and swift in denouncing the Taliban decrees, the Taliban plans, and the Taliban future plans regarding governance, and they call them un-Islamic. So Islamic State appears to be mobilizing people, at least it's the people who had broken away ties with the Taliban in the past, the militants who had been part of the several Pakistani right-wing extremist groups and militant groups, such as the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, such as the Lashkar-e-Jangvi al-Alami, and such as other Kashmir-centric groups. So I believe that the Taliban are failing largely because that they are not following the standard patterns of governance in the 21st century, sorry. And second, that they have been militarily restricted because no foreign aid is coming to help the Taliban to fight against the militant groups. And in this, when we look at from this perspective, then we find out that if the Taliban do not have security capabilities or abilities or necessary military equipment and know-how, then they will not be able to control or combat any militant group that, or a sophisticated militant group that the Islamic State once was. So I believe there are big challenges for the Taliban, and these challenges might force China to delay its plans of multi-billion-dollar investment in Afghanistan's lithium, nickel, cobalt, and other mineral sectors.
Thank you very much. That is fascinating. I'm beginning to get a picture, and correct me if I'm going off track at all, but when we're talking about China's Afghan agenda, it is not acting like we here in Washington and Europe as a rising power. It seems to be acting very pragmatically. It wants lithium and cobalt, but for copper, the price is too low. It doesn't want to deal with the Taliban because they're all over the place. And as I think, as we heard before, it can avoid Afghanistan completely. So it's not looking at Afghanistan as an expansion of its influence. It's looking at it as a transactional place that it can and cannot do business. And at the moment, it's not safe enough to do so.
I think what China does is like mostly business. And there was like Dr. Safdar and Airan also mentioned that they are not providing enough aid. China doesn't give aid. It wants to do business. That is very clear. But if you look at the Chinese investment in different countries, such as China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China has invested more than $50 billion, there are plans of investing more than $60 billion in Pakistan. Then China invested a lot of money, billions of dollars, over $23 billion in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
There was a comprehensive report this year by Nikkei, the Japanese newspaper, saying that most of the investments in Pakistan and as well as in Sri Lanka have been delayed by some reason and have not been fully materialized. So that money that China has already invested is trapped in those countries. And those countries are unable to pay back that. Yeah. So I believe that China does not want to open another pothole in the form of Afghanistan, that, okay, let's invest, put a lot of money here in Afghanistan. Maybe we will have a bigger return in future.
That's and the other issue, because we have a question from Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore, which touches on what you were talking about before. What about the rise of Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan? Is it stoking Uyghur militancy? Answer that as you wish, but there is this problem of the Taliban not being able to control more extreme, violent extremist groups.
Yes, Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, the ISK, is a totally different group than the Uyghur militant group or the Islamic Turkestan Islamic Party. Turkestan Islamic Party is aligned with the Taliban. They have actually fought with the Taliban, along with the Taliban, in northern Afghanistan, in Badakhshan province, as well as close to Tajikistan as well. Right now, there is a Tajikistani Taliban group. They are called Tajik Taliban. And the leader of those Tajikistani Taliban is actually responsible for securing the border with the Tajikistan, which has angered Tajikistan as well. Right. So Islamic State Khorasan will not stoke Uyghur militancy. Uyghur militancy in Xinjiang province, I believe, will begin once the Taliban and once the Taliban take in action against the Turkestan Islamic Party, which they will not do because they are allies and friends for over 2 decades. And the Islamic State in Khorasan is actually, as I said before, is posing a bigger challenge to Afghanistan, because it's not just ISK, but I believe that there are foreign intelligence help involved in that, supporting the ISK somehow to put a bit pressure on the Taliban.
Okay, are we getting to a situation whereby the Taliban will have to match the extremism that it's dealing with, whether it's Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or some other group, and we're going to get a gradually extremist, violent government in Kabul?
Actually, yes, that's what I have argued in my doctoral research as well, that in order to see what the Taliban did back in 1990s when they came into power, this time they are a bit slow, but gradually moving towards that. And this is something what I call a reverse state building discourse in practice. So what they do, this reverse state building discourse in practice, is characterized or marked by slowly, dismantling the previous state structures that were in place. So you are getting rid, you allow women, as Fatima Airan said, you allow women for some days, to work in the Ministry of Finance, and then afterwards you tell them, like, send a male member of your family, we will replace you with him, So these kind of strategies look like in the past, in 1990s, there was just one decree and it was implemented across Afghanistan within a day or 24 hours. This time the Taliban are slowly moving towards that. They are dismantling previous state structures and apparatuses and replacing them slowly with their own ideological state structures. And in this process, the silences, erasure of history, and erasure of cultural practices are noticeable, and they are vividly present. We see them. So I believe that ultimately the way, the Taliban look, despite the fact that there is a big difference of opinion among the Taliban leadership regarding the schools, girls' schools, and women's involvement in the public sphere, despite those differences, I see that they are slowly on that path where they are going to implement their idea of the state in a way by reversing the gains of the past 20 years.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you very much. Our final panelist, Lucas Myers, is from the Asia program at the Wilson Center, and he's going to wrap our arguments for us. He specializes in Chinese foreign policy and Indo-Pacific security, and he's going to delve further into China's interests in Afghanistan and look at the mitigating the risk, the building of stability, and this issue that now seems to have emerged through our discussions about the risk of terrorism being, once again, Afghanistan being used as a base for terrorism in that country to be exported. Lucas Myers, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Humphrey, for your kind introduction and to the Democracy Forum for hosting today's event. The other panelists have already done an excellent job laying out the details of China's agenda in Afghanistan. So I think I'm going to, as Humphrey said, I'm going to explore China's overarching perceptions and interests. So to understand China's interests, it's important to briefly summarize China's pragmatic approach since the Taliban takeover in 2021. So China has not formally recognized the Taliban, but it has engaged and kept its embassy open. It also allowed the Taliban to occupy the Afghan embassy in Beijing. It's also requested that U.S. sanctions be lifted on the Taliban, as well as provided some humanitarian aid, including COVID-19 vaccines. China resumed visa issuance in August 2022 and reduced cross-border tariffs on 98% of Afghan goods. It also proposed that Afghanistan join the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative. And via Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, China has opened a rail route to Afghanistan from Xinjiang. Now, through this diplomatic engagement, China acquired an agreement from the Taliban to remove Uyghur militants from its border regions, which has already been discussed. And so on the surface, these actions would seem to be a fairly open embrace of the Taliban. Indeed, a high-level Taliban delegation visited China in 2021 and received a fair amount of attention in the press at the time. Yet this does not mean that Beijing views the Taliban takeover as beneficial. It's more complex than that. China's fundamentally wary of long-term instability, and it's going to hedge, which can be seen in its rhetoric. In particular, Beijing's response to last year's U.S. withdrawal. Beijing criticized the U.S. manner of withdrawal as leading to destabilization, even though it had been a longtime critic of U.S. adventurism abroad. And the best example in recent months is China's discomfort around the assassination of al-Qaeda's leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry stated it is firmly against terrorism and actively involved in the international fight against terrorism. But at the same time, the statement hedged with criticism of the act itself, saying there should be no double standards on counterterrorism. Counterterrorism should not be conducted at the expense of the sovereignty of other countries. And so this is really a difficult line to walk, as it's attempted to ignore the Taliban's clear unwillingness and inability to prevent terrorist groups from operating from Afghanistan while also attempting to engage it. And so overall, China may have disliked the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, but it ultimately and fundamentally perceived a serious sense of threat emanating from an unstable Afghanistan. But at the same time, it's also unwilling to be that security provider in the region, and it defers to others on this matter. So in reality, China pragmatically engages the Taliban to advance its interests while we're remaining wary of blowback or getting too close. Recently, you can see this in Afghanistan's complex observer role in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which had a meeting last week. It's unclear going forward where the Taliban government really fits into this, as they were not invited to the recent summit in Uzbekistan, but they still remain an observer and they've participated at other levels. And so the reason for this cautious policy is that China is trying to protect its two main interests: one, stability, and two, connecting Afghanistan into its overarching regional economic network. So fundamentally, China's Afghan policy is guided first and foremost by Beijing's perception of Afghanistan's potential impact on the domestic security situation in China. China perceives a terror threat from Afghanistan, primarily from what it calls the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, but which has also been recently known as the Turkestan Islamic Party, as other panelists have mentioned. So while Beijing and the Communist Party certainly claim a threat of terrorism within China emanating from an unstable Afghanistan, it's first of all important to emphasize the actual risk of terrorism within China is very much overstated by Beijing for internal and external justification of its repressive policies in Xinjiang. Indeed, Beijing took advantage of the war on terror after 9/11 by echoing U.S. counterterrorism rhetoric to support its internal crackdowns. And firstly, ETIM is very small by all accounts, and its influence and capabilities to actually threaten China are quite minimal. Indeed, its existence as a distinct entity is even somewhat debated in the terrorist literature. According to UN estimates, membership ranges from several dozen to 1,000 at most, while the U.S. itself just delisted the group in 2020 based on an assessment that it no longer exists. And while there have been a few isolated terror incidents within China, most terrorist analysts argue that the threat is vastly overstated by Beijing for political purposes, and it's clear that China uses this rhetoric to justify its internal repression. Moreover, while some militants do hope to target China, China itself is also pretty insulated from Afghanistan directly. The border along the Wakhan corridor is pretty small, mainly about 50 miles and highly mountainous. And importantly, China's erected a massive surveillance state in Xinjiang that really renders the security risk quite small. So in reality, China deploys its counter-terror justification over the past 20 years, and particularly accelerating since 2014 with its Strike Hard campaign to crack down on its Muslim minorities, the largest of which are the Uyghurs. And it has labeled peaceful and political and cultural activists as terrorists to justify its repression of them. And more than 1 million Muslims have been placed in re-education camps since 2017. Widespread surveillance, torture, restrictions on religious practices, and other forms of repression are rampant in Xinjiang, which have led many, including the U.S. government, to label a genocide. Overall, the risk of terrorism is very much exaggerating. But importantly, there is a real regional terror threat to Chinese interests from Afghanistan, not within China, but the wider region. And so the main security threat to Chinese interests emanating from Afghanistan is not in Xinjiang, but rather Pakistan and Central Asia. And specifically because that security situation in Pakistan and Central Asia is intimately intertwined with Afghanistan. And especially now that the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan seems to have emboldened the Pakistani Taliban and specifically ISIS Khorasan in particular, which both increasingly target China. For instance, we've seen in 2016 that the Chinese embassy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan was bombed, reportedly organized by a group out of Syria. Moreover, Chinese nationalists and assets in Pakistan, particularly those associated with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, have been attacked numerous times, particularly by Baluchistan separatists and increasingly the Pakistani Taliban. And ISIS-K, operating out of Afghanistan, has increasingly announced in its rhetoric that it intends to target China. And largely doing so, it's attempting to outbid the Afghan Taliban by labeling them as weak, beholden to China, and unable to defend weaker interests. And the Pakistani Taliban, meanwhile, which has close ties to the Afghan Taliban, has also increasingly targeted China because of China's closeness to the Pakistani state that it opposes. And the best example of this is the 2021 TTP attack in Quetta, which appears to have targeted China's ambassador to Pakistan. And so thus militancy emanating from Afghanistan is a real danger to China within the wider region and its wider interests. And especially because the Taliban government has not demonstrated an ability or willingness to really control these militant groups. This is a real risk for China, and thus China has an interest in stabilizing Afghanistan. And so it reaches out to the Taliban to attempt to mitigate these problems. Then the other interest is much more long-term and has been discussed pretty extensively in this format already. Largely, China's hope to incorporate Afghanistan into its vision of regional connectivity. And I concur with Dr. Farr's conclusion that instability fundamentally limits this issue and renders it much more long-term on the horizon. And so really, China sees Afghanistan as centrally located. It's at the heart of Asia, so to speak. And China recently emphasized its hope to include the Taliban government in the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor as a linkage to bring all these networks together. And thus, it's really prioritized attempting to engage Afghanistan and the Taliban in particular in order to amplify its economic reach. It also sees beyond infrastructure some opportunity for resources, particularly critical ones such as, as mentioned, energy, lithium, rare earths, and copper. According to an assessment from a few years ago, Afghanistan is home to something like $1 trillion worth of minerals. And one of the largest projects on paper is the Mez Aynak copper mine, which, as has been discussed, was leased to China in 2007, but then has since become defunct because of security issues, which speaks to the larger challenge here that stability is the core of this. So China's second interest, in the economic aspect, is sort of limited by the first one. And so ultimately, China faces some serious persistent challenges in furthering these interests. Fundamentally because China is not willing to provide the security for Afghanistan. It does not want to be dragged into Afghanistan like like Russia or the United States. And so it's opted to cautiously engage the Taliban, as we've seen since the US withdrawal. And in general, Chinese foreign policy tends to be quite pragmatic and not ideological towards neighboring countries where it has significant interests but limited appetite to intervene itself. And China's approach here is not unique to Afghanistan. You can actually see some similarities to its response to the 2021 military coup in Myanmar, where Beijing is cautiously hedged with ties to the junta, but refrained from over embracing it. And so going forward, we can expect that China will continue to engage the Taliban in order to mitigate this risk of instability. And it'll also work closely with regional actors such as Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we've also seen a little bit of a tentative expansion in its own security capabilities in Central Asia. Most notably the establishment of a police base in Tajikistan near the Wakhan border to monitor the Afghan border alongside Tajik security forces. But importantly, it appears that this Chinese presence is mostly People's Armed Police, which is within China more of an internal security force aimed at internal dissent, which kind of points towards how China views this issue in its relationship to Xinjiang. But ultimately, it's still not willing to take over the security provision role in Central Asia that's been vacated by the United States. And it really will take a more economic focused and engagement focused path forward. And so in conclusion, we can see a few takeaways here. One, the Taliban is unwilling and unable to crack down on militant groups, which poses a problem for China. And there's not really an easy solution to this, especially because China does not want to provide the security that the U.S. has moved on past. And secondly, the instability prevents Afghanistan from becoming a lucrative market or target for investment for China, at least in the foreseeable future. And third, China's growing role in Central Asia is going to be mainly economic, as it does not want to complicate ties with Russia or take on that security provision role. And then Fourth, the greatest security risk from Afghanistan to China is not within China or Xinjiang, but rather Pakistan and the surrounding countries. As its economic footprint grows, China will find itself increasingly targeted by groups like the Pakistani Taliban and ISIS. Whether that encourages a greater security role remains to be seen, but right now we're not seeing it. And fifth, and finally, a stabilized Afghanistan where the central government can prevent Chinese anti-China militancy and spillover would serve China's regional agenda best. But right now, there's not an easy path forward for that, and China doesn't appear willing to take up a lot of the responsibility that would be required to do so.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a couple of times the Shanghai Cooperation meeting that took place last week. I think it was. Didn't get much coverage in the Western press, but it was quite an impressive meeting in a way of the countries that came together. We have a question from Philip Bowman. With both China and Iran having long-term interests in Afghanistan, what is the scope of cooperation between Beijing and Tehran in this regard?
Yeah, so, over the past, several decades, China and Iran have grown fairly close. They've signed several major agreements, and they're generally fairly close partners. I think they both share a similar interest in that they want to see Afghanistan stabilized. And they obviously work together, and it looks like Iran is going to be joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the future. But largely, again, I think China, it's a pragmatic approach. I think China doesn't see itself as benefiting from taking on too much exposure in Afghanistan. And what it wants to do is fundamentally hedge to protect itself. It doesn't really want to take on too much, especially because I think China's real primary interests remain more oriented towards its eastern side, right? It's Taiwan, it's the East China Sea, South China Sea, it's the border with India. I mean, Afghanistan is secondary in that sense. And so I think fundamentally it'll work with Iran, but I don't think it'll take too much of a lead on this issue.
So this, Shanghai Cooperation, which was dubbed by some in the media as an authoritarian meeting in the New World Order, as it were, this is not a NATO or European Union in the making, where they want to put their influence in a certain place in an alliance. And I just saw coming through on my feed just now, there've been attacks on Russians in Kabul. So Russia doesn't, Russia's hands off. So nobody really wants to touch Afghanistan in its present state. Could we have the whole panel up now? Because thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of minutes before we're going to go to Barry Gardiner. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put to the panel a question that's coming from Saeed Ajmal, which we've answered, but let's all give it another answer in a way. Saeed Ajmal says, my question is that in spite of the presence of ISIS and other extremist groups, will China invest in Afghanistan amid bomb blasts and firing incidents? We know that we've had the answer, but just bring it out a bit more. We don't have Christine Fair. Why don't we go backwards? Why don't we have Lucas? Can you start on that, and then we'll work back.
I think fundamentally, as has been mentioned by other panelists, China is fairly risk acceptant with its investments in the BRI. It's invested in quite a few unstable countries, and it is willing to accept some level of risk. But fundamentally, I think this is, Afghanistan is very much an unstable place and remains so under the Taliban. I mean, they don't have a monopoly on violence, and so they can't guarantee Chinese investments in the country. And fundamentally, that's going to be something that prevents Chinese companies from seeing a profit in Afghanistan and benefit. And so this is a long-term thing. If Afghanistan stabilizes, I could see a lot of Chinese investment, but that's very much not in the foreseeable future, in my view.
So this is a red line, as we heard earlier. I mean, there's been Sri Lankan investments, and there have been other investments where money has got tied up, but this seems to be a very definite red line. Pamir, Sahill, your view on that?
I think that as far as Chinese workers or Chinese experts are not targeted in Afghanistan, I believe that they will not be bothered much about what is going on in Afghanistan in security terms, and they will be interested in just taking away anything that Afghanistan can offer, like minerals or rare earth elements and these kind of things. So
they'll go in if they can identify what they want.
If they cannot get what they want from Afghanistan, then I think China will just walk away. China, I agree totally with Dr. Myers that China is not going to provide security to Afghanistan, and it is not. It is kind of insulated through that Afghan border. There is no actually infrastructure present for the militants to go through that side. Yes, the militants may enter China through Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, but not through Afghanistan. So China is pretty well insulated from the Afghan security problem in that sense.
Thank you for that. Fatima, Airan, your comments on the question of, in spite of the presence of ISIS and other extremist groups, will China invest in Afghanistan? I know you've answered it, but answer it again.
I completely agree, actually. Afghanistan is not unstable now, and now it's a matter of Chinese citizens whether their lives are at risk or not. And as it was stated previously, Afghanistan is not the priority for China now. So currently, it's unlikely that China would take the risk to come and invest in Afghanistan. And they are yet to see in the future, in considering the situation inside Afghanistan.
And of course, there's lithium, cobalt, and copper in other places around the world. Mohammed Tayyab Safdar, your comments on Saeed Ajmal's question?
Yeah, as I said earlier as well, I completely agree with Lucas and the other panelists. I don't think this is going to happen in the short run. Even if it's only extraction, the extraction of rare earths and all of these things requires a lot of legwork and putting in the infrastructure. It's not as if you're going to think one day, dig into the ground and get these minerals out. So I don't think that it's going to happen, at least in the short run, with everything else that's going on.
Thank you very much. Now, usually we have Barry Gardiner, the Democracy Forum chair, summing up for us. But he's been taken away, as I mentioned, because of parliamentary duties. He has recorded a video preempting our discussion, which we're going to play in just a second. But whilst that's going on, when we finish that, I'd like to go around the panel again, just in a few words, to define and sum up China's Afghan agenda so that we can all go away with something that we can encapsulate in our mind. But if we could have Barry's video now, Vineet, that would be great. Thank you.
Scratch history and you find geography. History, the story of peoples, their interactions, decisions, and behaviors, is always a product of geography. The physical features of the territory they inhabit, its resources, and the distribution of its populations and its neighbors. Perhaps nowhere is this more true than of Afghanistan. So as we look at China's Afghan agenda, we should start with the Wakhan Corridor, that narrow strip of a panhandle in northeastern Afghanistan between Tajikistan to the north and Pakistan to the south. At its eastern edge lies just 47 miles of a border with China, and more specifically with China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. China's maintained links with the Taliban over 2 decades, starting shortly after separatist violence in its Xinjiang region surged in 1998. Military camps were established in neighboring Afghanistan, led by Tahir Yuldashev. The Taliban allowed Yuldashev to open a training camp for the militant Islamic movement of Uzbekistan in northern Afghanistan, and among those he trained were Uyghurs from Xinjiang, which China saw as a direct military threat. Yuldashev also began to develop close ties with the nascent terrorist group Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, which wants to establish an independent state called East Turkestan in place of Xinjiang in China. China was also concerned about Afghan heroin that found its way across the border and pretty angered that Taliban income from the heroin trade was now funding separatist forces within China. All of this prompted China to reach out. But they stayed clear of the 2001 US-led military intervention and didn't involve themselves in ISAF. Although it has not formally recognized the Taliban as the official government post the Taliban takeover, China has kept its diplomatic mission in Kabul open and the Afghan embassy in Beijing has also reopened. In October 21, Chinese officials held discussions in Doha with leaders of the Taliban's interim government. In December, they established a bilateral working group on humanitarian assistance and economic reconstruction. At the end of July this year, Taliban Foreign Minister Muttaqi met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Tashkent, where Mr. Wang praised the new Afghan government's efforts in managing the economic and humanitarian situation, as well as the country's progress in improving the security situation. He stressed that China was ready to help Afghan farmers find an alternative livelihood now the Taliban had ceased the production of narcotics. Mr. Muttaqi also thanked China for the Airan Afghan Airlines flights to Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, adding that the initiative would help increase Afghan exports. China has provided economic and humanitarian assistance, opposed the sanctions, and called for the release of the central bank foreign cash reserves that were seized by the US after the Taliban took control. In September 21, shortly after the fall of the Afghan government, China pledged $31 million worth of aid, including food supplies and coronavirus vaccines. Foreign Affairs spokesman Wang Wenbin said, "As Afghanistan's friendly neighbour and sincere friend, China has been offering support for peace, reconstruction and economic development in Afghanistan to the best of its capability." And in June, China announced it would send humanitarian aid worth $7.5 million after an earthquake struck, killing more than 1,000 people. Earlier this month, the Taliban official tweeted that aid trucks had left China bound for Bak in province in the north of the country, which was particularly hard hit by the earthquake. China's primary interest in Afghanistan has always been driven by its domestic security concerns. This explains Beijing's pragmatic relationship with the Taliban. Certainly, there's evidence that in return for economic aid, the Taliban appear to be curbing their links to the Uyghur militant groups. In March this year, the Taliban promised Wang Yi to take resolute and effective measures to eliminate terrorist forces in Afghanistan. And in May, the UN Security Council reported some members of the TIP had been relocated from Badakhshan to provinces further from the Chinese border to protect and restrain the group. Nevertheless, it is clear that the security situation is unsettled and not entirely under Taliban control. Militant groups based in Afghanistan, such as Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, and Baloch nationalists, have carried out cross-border attacks against Pakistan and the China-Pak economic corridor, the infrastructure projects there, as well as targeting Chinese nationals working on them. There are also reports that in recent months the Islamic State Khorasan group based in Afghanistan has started targeting Uyghur militants in its recruitment and using China's policy in Xinjiang as a rallying cause in its propaganda. So China believes by engaging with the Taliban it can try and put pressure on the group to keep insurgents in check, but it's not clear that the Taliban can exercise such control. If it proves unable to do so, relations between the two could deteriorate rapidly. Back to geography. Afghanistan is rich in resources: copper, gold, oil, natural gas, uranium, bauxite, coal, iron ore, rare earths, lithium. After heroin, unregulated small-scale mining was the main source of revenue for the Taliban and for local warlords during the US war. But now they're in government, they need it regulated and commercialized. And for this, they look to China for help and investment. But security concerns have largely kept China away from investing in the mining sector. They also got their fingers burnt over the Airan copper mine, where their investment was renegotiated, blocked by an archaeological dig, and became marred in a corruption scandal in China itself. Brookings say that Chinese-Afghan mining deals theoretically make sense. China providing cash to soften the impact of international sanctions, and in return getting access to the lithium it needs for its huge battery and decarbonization ambitions. But so far, the signs are that the regulatory and security challenges are still too unattractive and will stop China from significant investments, at least in the short term. What about Pakistan? Pakistan and China's close diplomatic ties have deepened in the last few years. Defense cooperation, a burgeoning arms trade have both resulted in joint military exercises. And in part, that's been a response to India's strengthened defense and security links with Western partners through the Quad. Pakistan largely views the Taliban takeover as a positive. It secures its interests in Afghanistan and limits the space for Indian engagement in Kabul. China, on the other hand, has deep reservations over the Taliban's new role and the potential to disrupt China's domestic security should instability and terrorism grow. Several Chinese nationals working in Pakistan on CPEC projects as part of the BRI were killed in July 21 as part of a terror attack. China will try to leverage its economic investments in Pakistan to get them to press China's case for the Taliban to focus on limiting the power of terrorist groups in Afghanistan. CPEC is a major component of Beijing's Belt and Road, stretching from the Chinese city of Kashgar in Xinjiang to Pakistan's Arabian seaport of Gwadar. Islamabad seeks to leverage Chinese capital and know-how in order to upgrade Pakistan's infrastructure in return. Beijing gains a connection to the Arabian Sea, providing a contingency trade route to the risk-prone Malacca Strait in Southeast Asia. An important part of China's motivation in seeking stability in Afghanistan is protecting existing BRI projects in Pakistan, whilst potentially opening Afghanistan to future investments. At a meeting in July, Minister Wang Yi even suggested that the BRI investment could come to Afghanistan, saying China hopes to push the alignment of the Belt and Road Initiative with the development strategies of Afghanistan. Wang also announced zero tariffs on 98% of Afghan imports and the resumption of the issuance of visas to Afghan citizens from August 22. It's been suggested that Beijing will be happy to dangle promises and engage in talks on the BRI and CPEC extensions, but won't move ahead with anything on the ground until they're confident of political and security conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, in absentia. And as we wrap up now, let us go round in the order that we started. And if anybody disagrees or got a comment on what Barry said, just say it, but in a few seconds, and encapsulate for us what China's Afghan agenda is, and again, in just a few words. Mohammed Tayyab Safdar?
Yeah, well, lots what he said sort of resonates with whatever lots of us have said during the course of the last couple of hours as well. Two words come to mind: pragmatism and evolution.
Pragmatism and evolution.
Evolution is important because my Afghan colleagues have talked about how Chinese do not provide aid. That's changing. The China International Development Cooperation Agency is now providing, ODA type aid to countries like Pakistan. So there is a chance that the Chinese can now sort of, as Pakistan is the pilot case, they can now start providing the ODA type aid to countries like Afghanistan. So two words: pragmatism and evolution.
Okay, thank you very much. Fatima, Airan, did you agree or disagree with anything that Barry Gardiner said and your encapsulation of China's Afghan agenda? Oh, you are muted.
Sorry. Yes,
right.
Of course, I agree. And China's agenda, considering the current situation in Afghanistan, is so they can develop their relations with the Taliban now. And if in the future the situation changes in Afghanistan and the security is better, maybe then they can bring Chinese investors in and have a ground to invest.
Lovely. That's so pragmatism and evolution. I think if we hit Pamir, Sahill.
Yeah, we didn't say that China doesn't give aid to Afghanistan. It does, but it's far more or less than what the United States, for example, gave to Afghanistan since last year, August. The United States has given $774 million as compared to $30+ million that China has contributed. So China wants to remain engaged, continue limited trade, wait for some sort of stability, and then if the Taliban remain dominant without having any democratic government, that will be an ideal situation for China to strike deals with Afghanistan.
Okay, that's a very good summing up there. Lucas Myers, wrap it up for us.
Well, and I agree with all my fellow panelists in that really the watchword here is mitigating risk and ensuring stability, and that China just kind of wants to avoid responsibility and maintain and protect its own interests.
That's great. Thank you. And you agreed with everything Barry Gardiner said, did you? Any disagreements?
No, I think the overarching issue here for China is that it wants to avoid exposure and risk, and I think that everyone is sort of, I think, agreed on that point.
Yeah, pragmatism and evolution. I think we'll go with that. That's it. We are out of time. In fact, we are over time, and we covered a lot of ground, and we actually came to a hard 2-word conclusion there. Read about all these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. In the latest issue, we've got a Belt and Road Initiative piece, the truce between India and China, with a question mark, and the global ramifications of the Ukraine war, and much more. Our next Democracy Forum debate is October the 26th, the global reaction to the Sri Lanka crisis, which we mentioned there. China's hand at work again, question mark. Thank you, Christine Fair, Mohammed Tayyab Safdar, Fatima Airan, Pamir Sahill, Lucas Myers. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so skillfully giving us that backdrop, and Barry in absentia for your insights that the whole panel agreed with. Until next month, stay involved, stay safe, and from the Democracy Forum, goodbye. Bye.
Bye.